and welcome to Decarbonization and Net Zero Emissions. Today we're talking about the view from nation-state analysts, and it's a pleasure to have a full slate of guests from all over who will be joining us today. And it is also a pleasure to announce to you that there are a couple more talks in this series, and we look forward to mentioning those a bit later on. And we're recording live from Kerwin Hall at American University, where we are coming back face to face. So without any further preliminaries, let me please get to the first speaker, who is Katie Ross of the World Resources Institute. She's going to address momentum and credibility of net zero targets. She's a research associate in the climate program at the WRI, where she has more than a decade of international climate policy experience, particularly focused on emerging economies. At WRI, Katie supports countries in designing and implementing long-term decarbonization strategies, as well as in enhancing their commitments under the Paris Agreement. She also tracks and analyzes national net zero commitments. It's really a great pleasure to have her start us off in this discussion of how it is that we are all going to be able to get to net zero emissions, probably or preferably by 2050. So let me introduce Katie Ross and thank all of our guests for coming.
Thanks so much, Todd, and it's a real pleasure to be here today, and thanks very much for the kind invitation to participate, and really lovely to see that you're slowly bringing students back. That's fantastic. Just gonna put on my screen. Trust that's working okay. Right, so I'm going to cover the momentum and credibility behind net zero targets. So I'm sure you've just seen the most tremendous interest in net zero recently. In the last year alone, there have been incredible commitments from some of the world's largest GHG emitters. We've seen commitments from Canada, from Brazil, from the US, China, Japan, South Korea, all these economies committing to going net zero, and then preceding that, some commitments from the EU, the UK, Germany, and others. So there is this real tremendous movement around national commitments toward net zero. And then at the same time, there are some critiques around net zero. You may have seen some opinion pieces coming out recently saying, don't be fooled by net zero pledges, and Greta Thunberg's speech in Davos a couple of years ago saying, forget about net zero, we need real zero. So I just want to spend a bit of time today talking about what it means to actually go net zero, what technologies need to be employed to reach net zero, whether we're on track or not for reaching net zero by 2050, and kind of address some of these questions around whether these targets are greenwashing or can really lead to some transformational change. So this is a nice little illustration of what it actually means to go net zero. With it's just an idea. It's emissions on the y-axis and years on the x-axis. And what you have above the zero line is human-caused GHG emissions, which would continue to go up without some stringent mitigation measures. With some strong mitigation, we can taper this curve down to quite low, but really difficult to reach net zero or reach zero based on current known mitigation technologies. There are just some areas that are really difficult to abate right now, such as in industry, aviation, some pieces of agriculture cannot get to zero right now. We cannot stop the cows from emitting methane, cannot stop fertilizer from emitting nitrous oxide. We just don't have the solutions available yet. So as a result of that, the amount of GHG emissions that are emitted need to be balanced by an equal or more amount of removals. And this is what's illustrated by this green area below. And that can come from natural solutions such as forests and lands, which act as natural carbon sequestration and sinks, and then some technological solutions which are coming to bear recently, such as direct air capture and CCS. And then what you have is the sum of the grey shaded area and the green shaded area coming to an equilibrium of around net zero emissions, as Todd said, ideally by 2050 or sooner. Then a question is, well, how do we reach net zero emissions? No sectors can hide in this situation. So we need massive and fundamental transformations across all sectors of the economy. The examples that I illustrate on this slide are really not exhaustive, but just gives you a flavor of the kind of transformations that need to take place. For example, coal-fired power plants ideally need to be phased out entirely by around 2040. There needs to be a rapid deployment of renewable energy, of clean energy, of energy efficient technologies, ideally with 100% clean energy on the grid by 2050. Massive changes to buildings, decarbonizing heavy industry, phasing out the internal combustion engine, and important shifts on the land sector in terms of how we produce food, needing to become much more efficient, needing to restore degraded lands, needing to reforest to act as those carbon sinks. And then some changes on the behavioral side, such as reducing food loss and waste and changing diets. And I think importantly, in all the scientific scenarios that are shown these days, in order to reach net zero, we also do need to make these investments in these technological carbon removal solutions, as I was mentioning earlier. So is the world on track yet for net zero by 2050? There has been just incredible progress in terms of addressing climate change. And I think that the benefits of climate change are becoming increasingly well understood. I think it's no longer a question of economic growth versus climate action. We're seeing increasing evidence that both can coincide. And there has been tremendous progress in some sectors, but in a nutshell, the world is not currently yet on a track to halve emissions by 2030 and reach net zero emissions by 2050. Some colleagues at World Resource Institute did this report last year looking at the state of climate action and the shifts that really need to happen over the next decade, and renewables need to be ramped up at least 6 times faster. Tree covers need to be increased by at least 5 times. And these are just illustrations of some of the changes that need to happen. And I won't go through them all, but you're welcome to read more at this State of Climate Action report. So how many countries have set net zero targets? And I will start this with a disclaimer that depending on who you're speaking to, you're going to get a different count. This is the Climate Watch count that's managed by the World Resources Institute. And the Climate Watch count states that 58 countries representing 54% of global greenhouse gas emissions currently have a net zero target. And the shadings here illustrate whether the net zero target is in law. So that's illustrated in yellow. I think there's only 6 countries that currently have a net zero target in law: UK, Germany, New Zealand are some. The blue shaded area is whether the country has a net zero target in either a policy document or in their nationally determined contribution or in their long-term strategy. And then the orange color illustrates whether a country has made a political pledge toward reaching net zero. So that's in the case of China, for example, committing to reach net zero by 2060, and the statement coming out last year. So that's a picture of where the world stands on countries committing to net zero. I imagine we're going to be seeing several more commitments coming out in the coming year and years as well. So just speaking about this question of whether net zero targets are a form of greenwashing, we've done some thinking about this and really looking at what would it mean to set a robust and credible net zero target. So the first thing is that the net zero target at a national, and sorry, I should just say I'm speaking at a national level in this case. I know Janet's going to speak more on the private sector, but this is applicable to the national sector, to the national level. So the net zero target should ideally cover all greenhouse gases in all sectors. So there's no hiding here. Most countries are setting targets that cover all greenhouse gases in all sectors. New Zealand is one notable exception, having methane comprising about 50% of the country's inventory and not including methane in its net zero goal. The second point is real clarity on how much the target is met through domestic emission reductions. When we're getting to net zero everywhere by around 2050, there's really going to be limits to how many international offsets can be used and really limits on the land sink capability. So clarity on how much of the actual mitigation is happening within domestic borders will be important to know as part of the target. The target should also be communicated very clearly. So if you're watching some of these developments that are coming out, some countries say, we're going net zero, which is a bit more clear, net zero GHGs, that's quite clear. Some countries say carbon neutrality. Sometimes they really mean CO2 alone. Sometimes they actually mean all GHGs. Some countries say climate neutrality. So some definition about what their neutrality commitment means is important. Also important to know when they plan to reach their net zero goal. Most countries are quite good about this. Some countries have said we plan to reach it as soon as possible in the second half of the century. So that's a bit more vague. And then with the targets being so far into the future, generally, this is really where the rubber hits the road. It's about ensuring that this long-term target does inform both near-term targets, and that would be demonstrative in a country's nationally determined contributions. So as the updated nationally determined contributions come out this year and did come out last year, we're keeping a close eye on how those new 2030 targets align with this longer-term decarbonisation trajectory. And while countries are being quite frank in their assessments of, hey, we're not actually sure if we know all the answers about reaching net zero, that we understand, but ideally some plans and policies in place for reaching that target. And then just in conclusion, and I call it stay tuned because I think this is a really hot topic and going to continue to be this way. There is this growing movement toward net zero commitments. As I mentioned earlier, there are a number of countries committing to net zero. We're expecting more to come out this year and in the coming years. And I think the net zero debate is really going to be central to all of climate work in 2021. And this is because a number of countries are going to be coming forward with their mid-century strategies. These mid-century strategies are generally tending toward being net zero strategies for a number of major economies. The UK has said net zero is going to be a key priority of the G7. The Italians have said net zero is going to be a key priority of the G20. And the UK COP26 presidency has said net zero will be a priority. So you have these kind of sequence of international events all leading out to more ambitious outcomes by COP. The UN Secretary General, again, has said that the top priority of the UN is to build a truly global coalition for carbon neutrality. And then, of course, this is all set in the context of the economic recovery measures that countries are putting in place in response to COVID, also increasingly having some climate dimensions in there. And then finally, just some things to keep an eye out as well. There still will be some issues around net zero commitments. So keeping an eye on the credibility of the target, how much will there be reliance on removals and underdeveloped technologies, and importance of accountability. So both in terms of the near-term policies, the near-term targets that countries are putting in place as these clear stepping stones toward ultimately achieving net zero by 2050 or sooner. So with that, I will stop. And thanks very much again for the invitation to be here.
Thank you very much. We appreciate very much your opening panorama and explanation about sort of the broad process of getting to net zero. And I guess hope that in the questions and answers, we may be able to talk about some of the political obstacles and the unevenness of will that seems to still exist, unfortunately. But so thanks for laying out the basis for the discussion so ably. And I guess we'll turn to some specific regional case discussions now. and ask Klaus Röhrig of the Climate Action Network, CAN Europe, to help us understand what is the EU Green Deal and how is it considering a net zero future. Mr. Röhrig is the Energy Policy Coordinator at Climate Action Network, based in Belgium, where he promotes sustainable climate, energy, and development policies throughout the region. He has utilized his experience working for Greenpeace Germany and Green Budget Europe to analyze environmental policy within the European region and provide valuable technical information to CAN Europe's 160 member organizations. We thank you again for joining us late in the day for you, especially, and we welcome you to American University, where we are proud to be streaming live to you.
Thank you very much. Also thanks for giving me the opportunity. Indeed, here it's nighttime, but also happy to see so many students tuning in. I will just quickly share my screen with you and present. And as Todd rightly said, I just maybe one word before I start on the organization that I work for. So Climate Action Network Europe is actually the European Node Association of Climate Action Network International, which is a network of NGOs across the world, the equivalent of US CAN or the US Climate Action Network. And we usually represent also civil society at the COPs, at the UN climate conferences. And in Europe, we represent 170 organizations from many countries, also not non-EU member states. And then I work for the secretariat that does advocacy work and lobbying at the EU institutions on climate and energy policy. So, I will just give a brief, I try to be brief, overview, maybe a bit more of the political context and maybe the background about how did actually the European decision come about to agree on this net zero target that is at the moment in the process of being put into law. And of course, it's in the title, it's a nation state perspective, and of course that in the European Union context of like opens a whole Pandora's box is the European Union, a nation state, etc. But I won't go into this. This could probably fill hours of debate. So I would just focus a bit on this specific issue of the net zero and the long-term strategy that the European Union has adopted. So for this, we actually have to go a bit back in time. We have had a bit of a prelude that kind of culminated in 2018, and that was very much impacted by the special report of the IPCC on the global warming of 1.5 degrees, and then the COP 24 that took place in Poland, in Europe, in Katowice. And the then climate commissioner, Arias Cañete, used also that moment in Katowice to make a proposal for the EU to become climate neutral by 2050. So that was a new target, an update of a previous long-term strategy that had as a first target just greenhouse gas emission reduction of around 80% or 80 to 95%, and the push was to increase the target to emission reductions of 91 to 92 emission cuts by 2050. So this was kind of he set, so to say, like a ball in motion during in November 2018, which then started a long and very extensive public consultation process also throughout the next year. So this proposal that was also accompanied by a very detailed impact assessment was then discussed at EU institutions and also in national parliaments across the EU throughout the next year. So this impact assessment and the target proposal looked into actually every sector of the economy. So I liked also, I can just echo what Katie has mentioned, no sector can also hide in that challenge to achieve economy-wide carbon neutrality. And we see that this impact assessment also lay a bit the groundwork for the European Green Deal that actually came, that was built on this first approach of the proposal of the climate neutrality targets. If we see look into historic emissions in the EU, it is very obvious that the recent emission reduction trends are not really aligned with this long-term objective, and it was also clear that even the intermediate targets that the EU had already taken, so for example the climate target for 2030 was also not consistent with a long-term trajectory to reach climate neutrality by 2050. So it was already clear when negotiating this new target of net zero by 2050, part of implementing it would also be to actually increase the intermediate targets, so to get actually the kind of milestones in line with a trajectory that actually can reach a net zero goal by 2050. And how to do it. So now we come a bit into the, so to say, with the implementation, the kind of practicalities of getting there, which is the European Green Deal. So we shaped by the Fridays for Future movement. We had a surge in Green parties or Green party victories in Western European countries in the parliamentary elections, and that created a lot of pressure on the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen to be elected by or be approved by the new European Parliament, and she chose to make the European Green Deal the centerpiece of her political manifesto for the next 5 years for her mandate. And this European Green Deal was kind of centered around the idea of enshrining the net zero target into European law and about revising all the central legislative pieces to enable each economic sector to increase its climate ambition in the short and in the medium term. Officially, the net zero target was only then adopted in 2019 in December by the European Council, so by all heads of state and government of the EU member states. And this was also done at the same time as the economic recovery package. This was, sorry, in 2020, of course. This was the negotiations kind of were hand in hand, or went hand in hand with the negotiations about the economic recovery and also about the EU's multi-annual financial framework, so the EU's budgets. So those issues were immediately very tightly linked: climate ambition, reaching the net zero goal, and also the implementation and the financing of those tools. So just to give you a quick overview, this is from the European Commission's work plan. So it really shows that the European Green Deal is a long list of legislative revisions. So it's the biggest legislative climate and energy package that has ever been put on the table for revision almost in parallel. So we have issues really dealing with the kind of centerpieces of European climate policy, which is the emissions trading system and the effort sharing regulation, which deal with the emission targets for each of the economic sectors. But there's also revisions of energy legislation, renewable energies, energy efficiency, but also product standards or CO2 standards for cars. So it's a long list of different legislative initiatives. And I just mentioned here also the European climate law, which is kind of the, which is at the moment in its finalization process, which kind of enshrines the new targets for 2050 and also the updated target for 2030 into law. So maybe just to also say that from an NGO perspective, of course, we are very happy, of course, that the European Green Deal has become a centerpiece of the European Commission's mandate and the next 5 years. But we also still see that there are a lot of challenges, and of course we are very concerned that maybe some of the initiatives might not go far enough, or that they might not be that the different pieces of the puzzle don't fit or will not fit in the end together well enough. So we have also, together with other kind of big logo NGOs here in Brussels, developed an energy scenario that also, that shows that that maybe the modeling that the European Commission has done can still even be improved, and that we can even go further on certain elements. And we are convinced that, on the one hand, the targets need to be increased for renewable energies and energy efficiency, but also that each sector needs to do substantial steps forward in order to achieve the goal as it's been enshrined in the European Green Deal. I'm also pasting the links to this scenario in case you're interested at the end of the presentation. So I'm just I probably won't have time to go a bit into detail here, but maybe then just as some conclusive remarks, what we see as the main challenges, they relate to the overall ambition, overall, of course, to actually limit temperature increase to 1.5. Also, the European step will necessitate the cooperation internationally, and also kind of a positive competition in terms of ambition between major economies. And we see, so there may be echoing a bit what the quote that was mentioned before from Greta Thunberg. We see there's also a danger in a new approach that the Commission has taken to make the 2030 target a net target, where you have actually domestic offsets of carbon removals from forests against emitting sectors, which we find rather dangerous. Certainly the challenge will be in that now all sectors have to contribute. We have seen quite steep emission reductions due to the emissions trading system in the power sector, but we have a couple of laggard sectors, which is particularly the industry, but also transport and buildings. And these sectors now really have to catch up and really have to deliver relatively quickly deep emission reductions. And then there's the challenge of increasing in a sustainable way the carbon removals capacity by nature restoration, and also forest protection in a way that also goes hand in hand with biodiversity protection. And some of the elements that I brought on the table also have a challenge of forging political and social acceptability. I think one element that is quite widely discussed also outside of the EU is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So a tax on imported on goods based on their carbon content. This is something that is being tested in the European Commission, and that is probably being proposed very soon. So we expect a very fierce debate on it. And then domestically, we see more focus on social impacts of climate policy, especially with the measures that have been proposed to tackle emission reductions in the transport and building sectors, as they will get very close to consumers and citizens. And we have in Europe, of course, the experience with the Gilets jaunes protests, for example, in France. And this will be one of the key challenges also for the upcoming revisions. I will leave it here and also leave a couple of resources links also to the data set and the modelings of the European Commission, but also of our NGO network. And yeah, happy to stay in touch for any questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Klaus. That was also very good overview of the European situation, and we look forward to hearing more about the ambition of the European framework and the Commission's interest in net zero versus also the level of progress made so far. I mean, it looked like in one chart that it wasn't quite going to make it at 2030, but we look to Europe as the world's leader, so we're hoping that Europe will be able to do that. So thank you, and we turn now to a one-time world leader looking to get back into the swing. And we have Dr. Dan Fiorino, who is our boss at the Center for Environmental Policy. He's the founding director of this institution, and he's a distinguished executive in residence in the School of Public Affairs at American University and a faculty member in the Department of Public Administration and Policy. He teaches environmental policy, energy and climate change, environmental sustainability, and public management. His publications have received 9 national and international awards from the American Society for Public Administration, the Policy Studies Organization, and the Academy of Management, just to name a few. We're very pleased to have Dan Fiorino with us. And also, Dan, just as you are the director of the center, I want to thank Gabriela Siegfried for all of her work. You all have been in touch with her, and she's helped coordinate these programs and also now help set up the technical aspects. So thank you, Gabriela, and we turn it over to Dan.
Thank you, Todd. It's great to be part of this panel, and congratulations to Todd for putting together a terrific series on decarbonization. So I guess we're sort of the midpoint. And I'm going to talk a bit about what's happening at the state level, not getting into details, of course, but I guess what I would call energy federalism. So I promise some good news and some bad news. And in the energy field, there really is good news, but there's a lot of heavy lifting to be done. So I guess that's where the bad news comes in. So when we think about being part of a federal system, as the US is and many other countries are, there's a lot of thought about, well, what are the potential benefits of having a federal system? And by federal, we mean, 2 or more levels of government that may have overlapping, but also have some autonomous areas of authority. So it's not a unitary one where everybody's following the same tune, but you get a lot of variation. And there's certainly a lot of benefits that come with federalism. One is Martha Durthick, a political scientist, who called it compensatory federalism, where one level of government makes up for failures or inaction at another. So that's a good thing. Opportunities for innovation, learning, and competition. I think we see some interesting examples among some of the leadership states to sort of compete to establish their credentials. Scaling up and scaling down. A lot of progress can be made when states copy the federal experience, or I think more typically, federal government copies the state experience. And certainly California and our history with air quality illustrate that. And then I also would add policy stability, where particularly now with energy and climate being highly polarized issues, we get swings back and forth at one level of government, and the other level can help stabilize it, sort of act as ballast or a buffer. So good news, I'll just go quickly through this. There's certainly a lot of things that constitute good news in the clean energy field. Dramatic fall in PV and wind costs, which have been, if you've been looking at some of the work from the 1990s, and renewable energy was hydropower. People didn't really anticipate the kind of potential scale up that we have in other areas. EVs are increasing in market share, falling in price, extending in range. A growing number of US states, like countries around the world that Katie talked about, have made net zero carbon commitments or commitments to totally renewable energy by 2050 or sooner. A number of states now follow California's zero emission vehicle mandate. I think one of the benefits of our federal system. I count about half the states have mandatory energy efficiency resource standards. And wind and solar are going strong in terms of new installations. Of course, there's some bad news. Electric vehicles still are less than 2% of new vehicle sales. And given that the average lifetime of a vehicle is 11 or 12 years, it'll take a while to scale that up, but at least we're moving in that direction. Solar PV is still a very low percentage, although growing at a high rate, but from almost a zero base. Dozens of states are missing just terrific opportunities to improve their efficiency, which is a bit shocking. Some states have reversed aspects of their clean energy program, so that's certainly a source of concern. And clearly there's a need for lots of investments, lots in progress in a variety of areas, PV and offshore wind and transmission capacity, smart grid, storage, and some of the complementary technologies that will be important in this transition. I always like to point to Virginia as an example of how jurisdictions can turn around fairly quickly. I mean, historically, Virginia was not necessarily known as a leader in clean energy, but last year, a handful of seats flipped in the state legislature. They already had Democratic governor, and everything's lined up. And Virginia passed a Clean Economy Act, which has a 100% commitment to renewable energy by 2050, a big commitment to offshore wind and expanding storage, and getting into the regional greenhouse gas initiative. So taking the steps and establishing the authority and policies that are needed to do that. So things can change fairly quickly. And a point I want to look at is what role does partisanship? I mean, does it matter who's running the state government? In fact, it does. This is my one academic study that I will mention, but Samuel Trackman of Berkeley did an interesting study. He looked at 4 energy policy areas: renewable portfolio standards, energy efficiency, distributed generation, and oil and gas severance taxes. And he was interested in our policies, sort of leadership policies on these issues, a matter of partisan makeup or unified control of government, or is it a matter of resource potential? And he found, interestingly, that for renewable portfolio standards, partisanship was the most predictive. That is, the overall partisan leanings of the electorate in a state. With energy efficiency, you had to have unified control of the executive branch and the legislative branch. Distributed generation, a little mixed, but some effect from resource potential. And then for oil and gas severance taxes, partisanship didn't have an effect. As a matter of fact, some of the states with active oil and gas severance taxes tend to be more conservative states. So not really much of an effect there. So this suggests that, well, partisanship is important, but maybe there's some room for resource potential, such as availability of wind, to make a difference. And I'll get back to that in a minute. But I just wanted to look, I've a long time been a follower of the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, the ACEE's State Energy Efficiency Scorecard. It's a very comprehensive assessment of state energy efficiency policies. There's some performance elements in it, but it's mostly focused on policies. And just eyeballing these, partisanship really does seem to be the critical factor, which is interesting because energy efficiency should be a fairly nonpartisan issue. But when you look at the top rankings in the most recent version, I list some of the states there. All 10 of the top 10 states in the rankings supported the Democratic candidate, President Biden. in 2020, but so did the next 10. So the top 20 were pretty consistent. And when you look at the bottom 20 in the rankings, as I counted them, all but one, 19 of 20, supported the Republican candidate. The exception, by the way, was Georgia, which is an interesting story in itself. But on something as apparently sort of neutral and, let's be more efficient to save money as energy efficiency, there's a pretty strong partisan relationship. So maybe, since Mr. Trackman did his work, things have moved a little more in this direction, but I think that's significant. But if we look at a couple of other indicators briefly, this is from the Energy Information Administration. So this is 2019, I forgot to put this, but in 2019, the states with the largest percentage of wind generation capacity. Texas, of course, has the largest amount, but in terms of percentage, Kansas, Iowa, North Dakota, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. And states with the fastest growth in wind capacity, South Dakota, Rhode Island, which is offshore, and Nebraska. So this tells me, these are not the most liberal states in the country, with the exception perhaps of New Mexico moving in that direction. But it tells me that resource potential also does matter. And so I think there may be some interesting lessons to draw from that. And then I looked at states with the largest percentage of solar capacity. And as we might expect, California leads the pack. Nevada, Hawaii, of course, has its own compelling reasons to move toward clean energy aside from the environmental and climate effects. Arizona is sort of an obvious case, taking advantage of a resource. And Utah, and states with the fastest growth in solar capacity, Kansas, Hawaii, South Carolina, New York, and Wisconsin. So a little more variety in this case, but clearly resource potential can make a difference. So I think partisanship is important, but it may not be the only factor as we look at where states are going with respect to clean energy. By the way, I've also always liked a report that the Union of Concerned Scientists did in 2017, where they did a clean energy momentum state ranking. And a lot of the states that are popping up here were top states in that one as well: California, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Hawaii, and so on. So it's pretty clear who the leaders are, and also clear at least who some of the laggards are. So some conclusions to draw from this. There's a lot of research in the field on the effects of federalism on environmental performance. And it's hard to isolate federalism from all sorts of other factors. But looking at the recent US experience, I would say this was an absolute virtue. In a unitary system, the Trump years would have been a disaster for national climate policy. So having states that could pursue some independent courses of action turned out to be a virtue. So these states kept a lot of options, a lot of policies alive, and offer some really good experience and building blocks for building national policy now. Second conclusion, that linking state and national policies, sort of building complementary policies, can be very effective. There's some interesting work in the literature on the synergies between something like the production tax credit at the federal level, which really helped wind development. And when it lapsed, by the way, wind development went down. When it was reinstated, it went down. But sort of the effects of something like that combined with state level renewable portfolio standards or energy efficiency resource standards can be very productive. And now, as we look at a national infrastructure program and pretty substantial funding for that, if it passes, combining that with these state mandates can be a very effective combination. And third, climate policy polarization is a barrier in many lagging states. Climate change is probably the most polarized public policy issue right now. And I think states in some cases may not be pursuing opportunities because of the effects of polarization. So maybe, you know, something to learn from that is that frame this as an issue of clean energy, where people seem to be more positive about the economic and environmental benefits of clean energy than climate mitigation. And the partisanship makes a difference, but resource potential, the availability of different kinds of resources can be powerful as well. So with that, I will thank you, and I will hand it back to Todd.
Thanks, Dan, for bringing partisanship and indirectly politics right into the center of this discussion. I'm sure we look forward to raising that more in the question and answer. And also just, I guess, wondering aloud how the relationship where states are the top level actor, you know, in some cases, in say the blue states that were usually the leaders in the areas that you talked about, how they will be able to subordinate in the Biden administration to executive authority, or whether they will. I mean, I guess these are questions that hopefully we'll be able to address in the question and answer. And so thank you for providing us with that interesting nexus between structure of institutions and structure of institutions and policy outcomes. And our next speaker will also hopefully be able to do that for us with a vastly different set of institutions. Joanna Lewis of Georgetown University is a Provost Distinguished Associate Professor of Energy and Environment and Director of the Science, Technology, and International Affairs Program at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. She has 2 decades of experience working on international climate and clean energy policy with a focus on China. At Georgetown, she conducts research on the technical and political factors that shape low carbon transitions, and she leads several dialogues and joint study groups facilitating US-China climate change engagement. She's also an author of the award-winning book, Green Innovation in China, and she was the lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 5th Assessment Report. And she's also a co-editor of the Oxford University Energy and Environmental Politics series. So it's a pleasure to introduce Joanna Lewis, who will speak on where does China stand on net zero policies. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Todd. Let me set this up. Great, so I'm going to speak about China's move towards carbon neutrality, and beginning with some of the current trends we're seeing in China in the energy and emissions space. So, you know, overall, total energy consumption is not only going up, it's been going up much more rapidly just in the last few years than we had been seeing for most of this decade. And as a result, energy intensity has been declining at a slower rate than it had been as well. And this has implications for overall emissions and what's happening within the overall structure of the economy. Of course, the majority of China's greenhouse gas emissions are driven by its energy sector, which is why I'm focusing on this. And China is still predominantly fueled by coal. And while coal had been declining in terms of the total share of coal in total energy, you can see, from over well over 70%, almost 80% back in 1990 to now below 60%. You still see coal consumption on the rise. And in fact, if we sort of zoom in on the last few years, there had been a lot of people proclaiming back in 2013, 2014 that coal had peaked, and that coal, demand was going to be on the decline in China from there on out. But looking at the data that we now have for the last few years, we see that that was, in fact, not the case. And the 2020 numbers that have been released by the Chinese government, the official data show that coal is now actually above where it was during the supposed peak in 2013, 2014. And then in terms of the actual coal power fleet, you see that China had been slowing its building of new coal plants. That's that little dip you see there in red, and those too are on the rise in terms of new coal plant approvals. And this is really problematic, because particularly because a lot of the current coal plants in China are running below capacity, and you still have a huge share of China's power fleet fueled by coal. The good news, though, in this space is that we still see extremely robust growth in renewables. China installed over 70 gigawatts of new wind power last year, almost 50 gigawatts of solar, compared with less than 40 gigawatts of new coal plants. So in terms of what's being built on the margin, new incremental capacity, the future is clean, but the base is still fossil. So I want to turn to some of the climate and energy goals that the Chinese government has released in recent months that have garnered a lot of attention. And there's essentially three sets of goals that I want to distinguish between. So first of all, there's the 14 five-year plan goals. These are essentially the near-term goals that drive China's energy and climate policy trends. So the 14 five-year plan was just released last month. And these are goals that run from 2021 to 2025. And they include this decrease in energy intensity, 13.5%, decrease in carbon intensity by 18%. China, tends to put its energy and emissions goals in intensity units, indexing them to economic growth because, economic growth is so crucial in China. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But then they also had a goal for non-fossil energy, which China includes in that bucket, essentially renewables plus nuclear, to be 20% again by 2025. China then has their NDC goals. These are, of course, the pledges under the Paris Agreement. And there were the initial NDC that was pledged back in 2014, which has been revised, was revised at the end of last year. These are 2030 goals. And this is what the current NDC for China as has been announced. So to peak CO2 emissions before 2030, to reduce, again, carbon intensity by at least 65%. From 2005 levels. This was an increase upon the earlier target of a range of 60 to 65%. And I should say the peak goal of peaking before 2030 had been a slight change from peaking by 2030, sort of depending on how you translate the actual pledge. There's also a non-fossil goal, again, 25% increased from 20%. So really this area of non-fossil energy is where we actually see the most robust targets. And there was also a new capacity target added, 1,200 gigawatts of wind and solar combined, again, by 2030. And then, of course, the other big goal that was announced, again, end of last year, is this carbon neutrality goal, which Katie mentioned earlier. And this is, again, that China achieved carbon neutrality before 2060, although not a lot of details about what exactly that would entail in terms of how that's defined, what types of gases would be included, what might go into being able to meet that goal. But I want to now kind of take these different sets of goals and put them in context of, trying to understand, are these ambitious, right? And also, how do these goals, these near-term goals really translate into long-term trajectories? Where are they in terms of getting us to a 2 degree or 1.5 degree warming scenario? So, briefly, you can compare the 14 five-year plan goals to what China did under the 13 five-year plan. And you can see that they had an 18% goal to achieve by 2020, which they did achieve in carbon intensity. They may have even surpassed that a bit. But the 14 five-year plan essentially keeps that 18% goal. So that would be essentially the same rate of decline, not anything more ambitious. For energy intensity, there was a 15% goal decreasing 2015 to 2020. And they didn't actually meet that goal, depending on exactly which GDP and energy numbers you use. They fell short of that, somewhere between 13-14% instead of 15%. And so because of that, you actually see a more modest goal for energy intensity decline in the 14 five-year plan, so a 13.5% decrease. And this, I think, very much, does reflect the fact that 2020 was, of course, a very slow economic growth year for China compared with the previous years because of the COVID pandemic. And I think this new target sort of works in a bit of a buffer to, start to increase economic growth again coming out of the recovery. So, you can look at some modeling studies that have been done. This chart shows two different studies done by, very prestigious think tanks in China. The Tsinghua Institute of Climate Change and Sustainable Development is the think tank, sort of the research institute based at Tsinghua that until recently, former climate minister Xie Jinhua, now, again, climate envoy, was leading. And so, and then CREC is the China National Renewable Energy Center, which had been set up by the Danish government and is based within the Energy Research Institute at NDRC. So both very influential think tanks, and you can look at the studies they've done, and they show that essentially, energy intensity in the 14th five-year plan timeframe is sort of way off where you would need to be to get to a below 2-degree scenario, sort of 1.5 to, depending on a wide variety of assumptions. And you can look at these reports in more detail to see those assumptions. And same for CO2 intensity. Again, what's in there is sort of way off what would need to be. Instead of 18%, CNREC says they would need to be 27% reduction in CO2 intensity during that period, as an example. So, moving to the 2030 peak goal, if China were to peak, before 2030, many people were sort of assuming that China's emissions, I'm now talking about total CO2 emissions, would peak by 2025. But for that to happen, again, this is a modeling study done a few years ago by Lawrence Berkeley Lab and ERI and RMI, the Reinventing Fire China study. And they show that, to get a 2025 peak, you would need coal to peak in 2020. And I've just showed you that that's not looking likely, given that, coal is back on the rise and is back up, at its highest level yet over the last decade. And then, you would need some sectors to peak well before 2025, industry in particular, because you're hoping to see slowing growth in the industrial sector in China. You would have needed to see emissions peaking by 2017, which did not happen, to allow for buildings and transport sectors, which are still growing very rapidly in China, to peak even later. So these are just concerning trends. So now sort of squaring this with the 2060 carbon neutrality goal, most of these modeling studies show increasing emissions between now and 2030, or even, some of them are actually looking at scenarios where emissions continue to increase through 2035. And this is a time frame, where Chinese leaders really are still viewing as critical period for the nation's economic growth. And so have not been willing to sort of project really, dramatic emissions declines during that period, despite the NDC and the 2060 pledge. And so, the recent Tsinghua study suggests that the 2060 target could align with a 1.5 degree global goal if after 2030, China's emissions decline somewhere between 8 to 10% per year, and get to a 90% total reduction from peak emissions by mid-century. And, okay, that's great, but such a rapid reduction in emissions would be completely unprecedented in terms of what any country has been able to achieve. I think some of the EU's most dramatic emissions, we were looking at, a few percent in a decade or so. So this is really, quite ambitious and, not to mention costly. So implications of this, I would just say that the 14 five-year plan goals that have been put forward by China are certainly modest and don't put China on track for carbon neutrality, for the carbon neutrality goal that they have pledged, or for a 1.5 or 2 degree global goal. And I do think that this likely reflects, the current political situation in China, the emphasis on post-COVID economic recovery, essentially at all costs. We didn't really see the green stimulus that we were hoping to see from China, which, to be fair, we actually saw come out of China in 2008, 2009 during the economic crisis. So, this is definitely, from a climate perspective, quite concerning. And the revised NDC that China has made, sort of signaling where it's going to be putting forward heading into COP26 are really, only incremental improvements off their first NDCs. you know, the non-fossil goal probably being achievable, but the peak year looking further and further out given recent coal trends. So if China waits until after 2030 to take a more ambitious, you know, to take more ambitious action to increase its targets, then these mid-century goals are going to be, you know, are going to require these very unprecedented and very expensive shifts. So, you know, I think the hope is that there's certainly going to be expanded international pressure on China to increase efforts prior to COP26. Of course, you know, there's going to be a lot of discussion on this heading into the Climate Leaders Summit later this month, and then, you know, heading into the COP at the end of the year. And so happy to talk more about that during Q&A. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanna, and thanks for such an extensive view of what looks like a very somber picture in China as well. So summing up, it seems that we've had some mildly disappointing news out of Europe. So we have some bright spots in the US, but we don't have a national strong policy implemented yet, which looks like we may. And in China, it seems that the news is disappointing as well. So it looks that at the international level, pressure must be brought to bear. And so I do thank Joanna for offering to talk about it in the questions and answers, and I hope that we'll be able to do that. We're going to shift a little bit because, you know, the nation states have a set of incentives that are somewhat different from those of the private sector. And some of the private sector's advances in some technologies and in new business models have helped bring some success. And we are very fortunate to have a speaker who is going to address some of those issues now. Janet Peace is Chief of Advisory Services. She's responsible for leading research, guidance, and engagement on key climate issues at Blue Source. And her clients include policy, natural climate solutions, issues of GHG inventories, carbon strategy, reporting, goal setting, and carbon neutrality. Prior to her work at Blue Source, she was the executive management team member at the Pew Center on Global Climate Change, and has helped launch its successor, the Center on Climate and Energy Solutions. At Pew and at C2ES, Janet led their engagement with the corporate community, including their Business Environmental Leadership Council, which is mostly Fortune 500 companies. She's a recognized expert on climate issues and advisor to the World Bank's high-level panel on carbon pricing competitiveness. And we are very proud to say that she is on the advisory board of the Center for Environmental Policy at American University. Thank you, Janet, for joining us and for a different perspective. Hopefully. Thank you.
Thanks, Todd. And unlike all the other speakers so far, I don't have slides, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about, you know, what I see at the corporate level. And before I get started, though, I just want to, you know, thank the Center for Environmental Policy for inviting me to be part of this webinar. It's fun to see small friends, and it's always fun to talk about where we are with deep decarbonization, even though sometimes it's pretty sombering. We're just not where we need to be in many cases. Before I get started, just in case, I think this is probably very likely, most of you don't know what Blue Source is. It's a pretty low-key company, but we're really a full-service climate and energy company. We advise large companies and small organizations. We advise some different cities. I've got a couple counties that are clients. And you know, we basically help them move forward on climate action, no matter where they are in the process, because everybody's got to start somewhere. And our goal is really to make it easy to understand what the different options are out there. You know, where do you start if you're looking at internal reductions? How do you do an internal carbon price? And how do you use environmental markets? For me, it's really a great time to be working on climate policy. I've been working on it for a long time. And at this point, you know, we're seeing policy being created and it's being expanded. And you know, the US is back in the Paris Agreement. Can I just say yay to that? And I really am excited by the level of effort that we're seeing from the corporate community, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. You have to say, first of all, what's really obvious is there's no one corporate community. Right? There's a variety, and what you see is obviously where you sit, and from where I sit, I do see companies stepping up their game, and that's super important because business leadership is really critical to the energy transition that we need to address climate change. Just a couple stats, and we've heard lots of stats today, but just a couple stats of why corporate leadership is so important. We need to make some pretty significant changes, and you've heard about those throughout the session today about all the different changes that we need to make to be able to meet the net zero goal that Paris lays out for us. But just to put some of that in context, we need to about 95% of our electricity is going to have to be low carbon by 2050, compared to about a third today. And this is according to a variety of different models that have looked at how we change to get to a net zero goal. So 95% of electricity. 7 out of every 10 new cars would need to be electric. And as Dan said, I think you said 3, today we have 1 in 100, and that's not just new car sales, but 1 in 100 on the road today are electric. At least that's the stats that I found. The entire existing building stock would have to be retrofitted, and the CO2 intensity of the industrial sector has to drop by about 80%, and that's going to be really hard. And I guess I am pretty practical in this, and I do think that we have to reduce fossil fuel use, but I think we're going to see natural gas is still going to be around. But in order to solve for climate, that means that those that are using it are going to have to use carbon capture and storage. So all of these changes, they're going to require investment. And IEA, the International Energy Agency, says that we need on average about $3.5 trillion in energy sector investments every year between now and 2050. That's about twice the current level of investment, and not a government on this planet can afford to do that. So the bulk of this investment has to come from the private sector. And the bottom line is just not going to solve climate. We're not going to solve these issues unless we get the private sector involved. And of course, for businesses to step in, they need to see a business case. They're not philanthropies. And I think some people forget that they're not philanthropies. So they need to see a reason, they need to see a business case for doing these things. And some of that, of course, is they see market opportunities. And I'm a firm believer that there are market opportunities, but I just think sometimes we forget that they are not there just to invest in the public good because it's the right thing to do. They also need to make a profit because they have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. At least I'm talking about large companies. So anyway, I'm going to talk about 3 general trends in the business community related to decarbonization. And again, I'm going to talk about large companies because those are the ones that I've spent most of my career working with. So first I'm going to talk about some of these ambitious goals that we're seeing. And then I thought I'd talk about the trend towards public disclosure. And then maybe some more trends that I think that are ongoing and that we'll see more of. So we started, we talked about the net zero goals, but I think there are some other goals out there that are pretty cool. We've seen a lot of companies commit to procuring 100% of their electricity from renewable sources. And other companies have committed to using only electric vehicles in their fleets. And of course, I think that setting a science-based target, I think, with the Science-Based Targets Initiative, that is super cool. We're seeing a lot of companies do that. And of course, we're seeing a lot of companies set net zero goals. And frankly, I think the reason we're seeing so many companies set net zero goals is because it's almost easier to understand what a net zero goal is than say, I want to do 80%. 80% of what? Or science-based, the average person's like, science-based target, what does that mean? But people understand what zero is. And net zero, I just think that's easier to understand. And I think that's one of the reasons we're seeing so many companies put those on the table. Just another interesting stat, in 2020 alone, the number of net zero commitments, according to the UNFCCC Race to Net Zero website, the number of net zero commitments during what was super weird 2020, right? They doubled. And I have to say, I know quite a few more companies that are looking at that type of goal, but just haven't announced yet. So I think it's understandable, it's realistic. It's realistic because, you know, a lot of companies can't eliminate all of their emissions. That's why the net is realistic. There's just some emissions out there that's just too difficult or too expensive to eliminate. Cement comes to mind. It's not that we can't reduce emissions from the cement use or cement and concrete sector, but if you think about it, concrete is essentially made out of calcium carbonate. CO2 is released when you produce cement. Even if you used renewable fuels or a nuclear reactor to produce the cement, you would still have CO2 emissions from the production. Process emissions are natural when you use calcium carbonate. So the net portion of a net zero goal, just, you know, I think it's probably obvious to everybody, but it just recognizes that there's going to be a need for some compensating for emissions that can't be reduced. I think net also allows companies to get started sooner. It lets them get going and time their investments in key types of mitigation technologies like carbon capture and storage. And I'm for one, I'm super happy to see all of the different companies and entities putting net zero goals on the table, even if they can't get, even if they don't know how they're going to get there. I'm married to an engineer, I'll just say that. And, you know, if you ask about doing something, you'll always say, well, I have to think, you know, I don't think that's possible. I don't think that's possible. Well, and you'll have a million reasons. But when we make a decision to do something, it always figures out how to make it work. That's what engineers do. He just always figures out how to get there. And so setting a goal is an important part of getting started. So like Katie, I think you can tell, I often get asked, are these net zero goals real, or are they just for PR benefits? And I have to say, I think the vast majority of companies that are putting these on the table, they're serious. And of course, maybe I have a bias because, you know, my sample is the folks that I work with, the companies that I worked with at Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. And why would they hire me? Why would they come to Blue Source? Why would they work for work with C2ES if they weren't serious about taking action? I also think companies are a little embarrassed when they put goals out there and they don't meet them. So I also think, you know, our election in 2016 shined a pretty big spotlight on whether companies were serious. You know, the administration rolled back all kinds of environmental rules, and Dan talked about some of those. And I remember some of my colleagues were saying, oh, you know, companies are going to think the candy store opened. But instead, we saw this huge outpouring of companies supporting the Paris Agreement and staying in the Paris Agreement. And after Trump's election, you saw huge momentum in the number of companies talking publicly about policy and publicly about climate action. I mean, you think that the Climate Leadership Council that's out there advocating for a carbon tax, or the CEO Climate Dialogue, which is all large companies also advocating for a price on carbon. And then recently the US Chamber and the Business Roundtable and even the API, the oil and gas industry, is starting to talk about we need, you know, climate policy. Some more stats, because I always like stats. I think they're just kind of a good way of proving the point, if you will. If you look at the Science Based Targets Initiative, that's hosted by 3 NGOs, Katie's organization, WRI, WWF, CDP. So when the Trump administration started, about 300-something companies were in the Science Based Targets Initiative. Today, it's about 1,000. So about a 3-fold increase during Trump's administration. Similarly, if you look at the renewable electricity RE100, another NGO initiative to promote renewable energy, today it's got about almost 300 companies that have committed to 100% renewable. And that's also about a threefold increase from the beginning of the Trump administration. And there's a recent survey that Deloitte did, and they asked companies about, what do you know about renewable electricity? Are you going to do more about this? And about 45% of the companies that they surveyed, and there was thousands of companies, about 45% said they were committed to increasing the amount of renewable energy they used. So I think that many, if not most, very large companies are beginning to see climate change as the context under which or within which they operate. You know, climate change amplifies risk, it provides opportunities. And again, I'm coming back to the point that there has to be a business case. And part of that business case is reputation and brand value. Absolutely. You know, companies like to be seen as leaders. Think of the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, Newsweek Green Ranking, for example. And of course, there are market opportunities. You know, there's top line business growth opportunities. Say, for example, like low carbon cement or carbon capture and storage, key technologies that we're going to need. And also, you know, let's not forget there are policy efforts, as Dan talked about. There are a lot of policy efforts which are expanding, whether it's a city, whether it's state, and now at the federal level. And of course, internationally, there are a lot of policies that are actually moving forward. And for all of these reasons, and also from what I hear, I do think that these net zero commitments are real, and that the companies have really stepped up their game in this space. Coming back to reputation and brand value for a minute, I want to talk a little bit about trends that I'm seeing with public disclosure. And you know, I think we don't have to talk too much about this, but there is a real push to putting out more about what am I doing on strategy, how am I addressing and bringing climate risk into my organization. And I think part of that is brand value, and part of that companies see that the writing is on the wall. There's going to be more requirements in this space. But I also think companies are starting to see value in it, because you can't manage what you're not measuring. So when the task force on climate related financial disclosure first put out their recommendations, they didn't have very many supporters. And today they have about 1,800 companies that have signed on, and many others who've not signed on that have actually just done, here, let me tell you how I'm managing and bringing climate into my strategy. There's another survey. This time it was a PricewaterhouseCoopers PwC survey, and they asked companies about, are you putting climate risk in your strategy? And about 40% of the CEOs, they surveyed 5,000 companies, about 40% said that yes, climate was in their strategy, or they're thinking about their strategy. So I think we're going to see more climate disclosure. I think we're going to see more companies putting these voluntary targets out there. And I also think that we're going to see companies continue and expand the use of environmental markets, renewable fuels, renewable electricity, and greenhouse gas offsets. You know, I know not everybody loves those, but not all sectors can eliminate all of their emissions. And we need increased investment in sinks, both natural sinks and geologic. Results-based funding for carbon sequestration from the private sector can really help encourage and incentivize emission reductions and removals that likely wouldn't have happened without that incentive. So putting a value on these things by way of creating carbon offsets is one way to incentivize the investment in sinks. And, you know, without that value attached, there's always going to be more financial value again if you just harvest. So you got to put that. That's why I like it, because you're putting a value on something that's not there before. So anyway, I think there's a variety of trends that we're seeing, but at least for the corporate side, I see the trends as very positive. And so I'll just leave it there so we have enough time for at least a few questions. Back to you, Todd. I can keep going.
Okay, sorry, thank you. Thank you very much. Those are very wise words from a broad view about some of the different incentives of the private sector. And indeed, I think you captured part of the problem well when you said that if the IEA says that $3.5 trillion are going to have to be invested in the energy sector every year, and that, you know, there's no government that can do that, that points to either a couple of sources, and one would be the private sector, which would have to have its own set of interests met in order to participate, it would seem. And the other source is perhaps the international community, that is the United Nations-based system that would presumably help push nations and regions in a better direction towards net neutrality by 2050. It looks like we're not quite headed there. And I have a set of questions to raise. I think I'm gonna at least take this one round of questions that I was able to glean from the Q&A. But I'm just gonna start with that question about sort of how do we get to push nations, regions to do more, and how can the private sector and the international agreements that we have be used and leveraged in order to help execute and get us where we need to go. So that will be one question, please. Another question, we have a question from the chat, from the question and answers about a very political question. Thanks. How can we take down the Koch brothers and Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro? That is to say, the climate deniers who are leading, continue to lead the parade of denial, which distracts from us getting our work done, right? I think that's a question asked. Another one is about deforestation and how to actually get incentives to prevent deforestation, which doesn't seem to be working. Another question is about magnetic levitation trains, which seem to work well in China and Japan. And yet in the US, we're obstructed by, according to the questioner, a lot of excessively tight laws from being able to build one of those. So how can we get that kind of transportation sector, large infrastructure project going? Another question, this one particularly for Klaus, is about the Circular Economy Action Plan and its role in sort of reducing emissions in the European Union. I think that's probably as many questions as we may be able to fit into the last few minutes. But I want to thank everyone again for those outstanding presentations, and maybe at least give everyone one chance to hit on any of these questions that they would like to, or other ones that they may see in the Q&A. Shall we go in the order that we started? Is that okay? Katie?
Sure, thanks. And thanks so much to the panelists as well. I loved hearing your presentations and learned a lot too. I guess I'll take the first one about how we get nations to do more. And this is how the Paris Agreement has been structured. It's been structured around the idea that nations will come together every 5 years, firstly to review progress toward global climate change goals, global finance goals, see how we're doing on adaptation. And this is what's called the global stocktake. The first global stocktake will happen in 2023. And then after that, countries are invited to resubmit their climate commitments in light of those findings. And ideally reflecting their highest possible ambitions. So there is this process underway of coming back to the table collectively every 5 years to review progress and then subsequently set new targets. I mean, we're already in the midst of that first thing happening right now as countries were initially going to set their updated NDCs last year. Because of COVID, it's stretched to this year, but countries are stepping up some marginally, some more so. The EU was a significant step up in terms of its updated commitment that they set recently. So this is something it's really just baked into the very structure of the Paris Agreement. I mean, ultimately on this arc toward achieving net zero as soon as possible in the second half of the century.
Thank you. Thank you. Klaus?
Thanks. Yeah, maybe then I take the question on the Circular Economy Action Plan. Yes, very good question, and indeed, I mean, also as Janet explained before, I mean, this of course is a particularly important piece for tackling industrial emissions, which have been stagnating in the EU in recent years, despite being covered by the emissions trading system. But the industry has received quite generous exceptions. They do not have to pay the full carbon price under the system. At the same time, there were insufficient incentives for driving breakthrough technologies in industries, and particularly energy-intensive industries have also innate problems such as the cement sector, as Janet mentioned before, with process emissions. Where but also we see also of course with steel production we see huge challenges where actually where the Circular Economy Action Plan is kind of a game changer, because it really tackles kind of the entire ecosystem, industrial ecosystem, in a way that rethinks value chains and looks into approaching kind of the entire kind of hard to abate sectors. Of course, what we still see, this would only be like one part of the challenge as well. We at the same time also needs additional drivers. So we also need to think about how can we generate enough investments, enough finances to also upscale the kind of technological challenges we need to also implement this Circular Economy Action Plan. But this is still to be designed actually as part of the Green Deal. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Dan?
I guess I'll take up for a minute the question of how do we get nations to do better? I mean, sometimes I'm actually amazed at how much of a sense of obligation there is in much of the world to start really dealing with the problem of climate change. So I think that's encouraging. If you take the EU and then throw in the US and China and a handful of other countries, it doesn't take long before you account for about 2/3 of the global emissions. So it seems to me if you can sort of get those countries together, I mean, I thought one of President Obama's big accomplishments was at least getting an agreement with China in 2014 to sort of be part of the game and to make commitments. And, the US and China, there's 40% of the emissions, and you throw in the EU and a few others. So I think it's really important for these leadership countries. And I think it is really critical now that the US is back in the game, and the US has to stay in the game and provide, along with the Europeans and some other countries, the kind of leadership, because I think, as the largest economy for the moment and a post-war leader on a variety of issues, that the US can play a really critical role. So, and there's sort of a competitive spirit that you see sometimes. You definitely see this among states, a competitive spirit that we don't want to be outdone by the other ones. So once you get people engaged in that kind of competition, I think you get good results.
Okay, thank you very much. Joanna.
Yeah, thanks for the great discussion. I mean, I would just comment on sort of the question of increasing international ambition and international leadership. I think there's an important balance between increasing ambition at the international level in terms of pledging more aggressive targets and goals and pushing domestic legislation that actually backs up these goals, right? Because the Paris goals are far more meaningful and more likely to be met if they're enshrined in domestic policy. So, even if China's goals in the 14th five-year plan might look modest, the fact that they're there, these are actually the 5-year plan targets in China drive all policy action at all levels of government. And that's a, extremely important tool that the government has to really push action. So, in many ways, that's more meaningful than a more aggressive international target that has very little, on the domestic front to back it up. So, I do think it's important that we have events like this Leaders Summit that President Biden is convening this month to highlight what countries are and are not doing and to try to build collective action, as was mentioned. So, for example, if all major economies could agree to stop financing coal plants in developing countries, that would put pressure on China and others to follow suit. So, I certainly think we'll see conversations like that happen in the coming months and years.
Thanks. I hope so. Yeah. Janet.
I'm a firm believer in market mechanisms. I'm a good economist. So I have to say in the Paris Agreement, there's a section that's not finished yet. It's called Article 6. And it's the section that is the market mechanism portion of the Paris Agreement. And I think that could get finished. And somebody asked about incentivizing avoided deforestation. Well, that's one of the places where providing an incentive for being able to transact and putting a value on those things, Article 6 could help with that. But I also want to just echo what Joanna said, that we need policy. You have to lay the groundwork. You have to provide incentives for clean technology, and you have to level the playing field, as Klaus said, for these energy-intensive, trade-exposed companies, so that they're not going to be just moving their production someplace else, because leaking greenhouse gas emissions to someplace else just doesn't really help. Doesn't help any of us.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you. I just want to thank everybody. I want to thank the audience, the excellent speakers. Just to encourage everybody to join us on April 22nd from 1 to 2:30 when we have the penultimate talk in this series, which is assessing the cost of climate change mitigation and the cost of falling short. So we look forward to seeing you again, and to all of our panelists again, a hearty thanks. And yes, we can applaud. Wow, not just this anymore. So hey, thank you guys for that too. Thank you all very much. We appreciate your words, and they will hopefully guide a new generation forward. So thank you. Oh yeah, let's show you the class.
Okay.
We're socially distanced here.
Full house, yes.
Extremely full house, but hey, there's a lot of online experience, and there's a lot of other people from the community joining us as well. All right, so thank you. Thank you
Thanks,
again.
everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.